Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Impact Farming Show. Today, we have an amazing guest. We have Bill Wirtz from the Consumer Choice Center. Bill, how are you doing?
All good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing fantastic, and I am excited to have you on the show. So, we've been seeing Dutch farmers, German farmers, French farmers, and farmers from across Europe protesting. And that is exactly what this episode is about. I've been watching your coverage. So, I really want to dive into this to get the who, what, where, when, why, and a little bit more of the underlying current story and facts behind what's going on. So, before we dive in, can you share a little bit more about who you are, your role, and your interest in the European farmer protests?
Of course, yeah. So my name is Bill Wirtz. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at Consumer Choice Center. I cover agriculture and trade policy, and I've been doing that for the last almost 5 years now. I'm originally from a very small country called Luxembourg, which gives me the advantage of being fluent in German, French, and English, which makes, the coverage of a lot of this a lot easier. And what I've been doing over the past few years is look at the agricultural policies that are being implemented. And since 2020, the significant reforms that the European Union has been trying to embark on, which, as we'll find out as we discuss this, has been the cause for a lot of these protests. So I have really, this used to be the very niche issue of policy reforms that was not known and not publicly discussed as much as it is now. But it's something that has been years in the making, and I've been following it ever since. And I've found out that now with the farmer protest, there's significantly more interest in the issue.
Absolutely. So, why don't we start with the German farmer protests? They started at the beginning of January, and there's been a lot of activity, a lot of coverage within our industry. But I still find there's a lot of people that don't know what's going on, why they're doing it, a lot of different theories and information floating around. So, why don't you talk about the German farmers, the start of their protests, kind of set the stage, and then we'll bounce back and forward a little bit and cover the subject.
Yes, so let me just start at the beginning. I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately, this has started with the fact that the German government is trying to plug a big hole in the budget. We're talking about 17 to 18 billion euros, and that is a significant amount that the German government, of course, has a few options of trying to mitigate. It goes into different types of policies to do that, but one, of course, is raising more revenue. Now, agricultural vehicles and diesel used in agriculture have always been exempt from specific excise taxes and CO2 taxes. And that is something that the German government suggested to end because it would raise about 1 billion euros each year. So the budget, would at least get somewhat closer. And the idea was to diversify it between different sectors in terms of cutting spending and raising more revenue. And farmers from the beginning had been in negotiation with the government and said, look, this is going to make it really difficult. We understand that if you run the numbers for 2023, that works out because we had a good harvest, but the tax increase would be for each year, and we don't know what the harvest looks like each year in the future. So they made those concerns clear, and the German government said, look, we really have a budgetary problem here. There's nothing we can do. And so the farmers took to the streets. And initially it was a sort of a quiet protest. So the protest actually started by farmers hanging their rubber boots on the signs of the names of the towns when you enter a town in Germany. So in rural towns they would hang their boots, and that's a type of protest, like because there's a German expression, hanging up your boots, essentially like giving up your profession or stopping what you're doing. Essentially, the message was, if the German government continues as is, a lot of us might have to actually retire or just declare bankruptcy. And then they took to big cities with their tractors, and thousands of farmers responded to that call by official farming representative unions and organizing groups. And it was a quite phenomenal display. I mean, anyone watching this, I do recommend to look at the imagery of how many people, how many farmers descended on Berlin, but also other major cities. to protest those measures. And I mean, it came to the point where at the speeches of those rallies, it was almost not an option for government representatives anymore to not show up. So you'd have the finance minister of Germany speaking at those rallies, explaining himself, and for the first 5 minutes couldn't even be heard because he was being booed by the farmers. So quite significant protests. And I think the most interesting thing about this is that so the farmers, one of the things they did was blocking the roads in and out of major cities. So this is blocking the motorways and saying we won't be able to get to work anymore because our profession might not be viable in the future. So why should you? However, I do have to say it is in stark contrast with some of the climate protesters who glued themselves to the roads because the tractors would always make way for emergency vehicles, which was not the case in the past, which gained the farmers' sympathies to the extent that in polling, 80% of Germans who are not associated with the agricultural sector said that they support the farmers in their protest, which is a lot, given that a lot of people were probably and not unjustifiably upset over those roadblocks. So what we've seen is that this had like significant political ramifications for a government that's already not particularly popular. So the farmers have added fuel to the fire, to the impression that the government is essentially out of touch with the necessities of working people.
Wonderful. Thank you for setting the stage. I want to take us a few years back because this movement and farmers expressing their discontent with ag policy didn't just start with the German farmers. I know back in October 2019, the Dutch farmers started off. So I think it's important to go back there and chat about that situation a little bit. So, can you speak specifically to the Dutch farmers and why they started protesting?
This all relates to soil fertility in the first place. You know, depending on the soil fertility of each European country, you have a fairly high or low fertilizer use. And the fertilizer use in the Netherlands is fairly high compared to the European average. And that, of course, brings an emissions burden that the Dutch government wanted to address. So according to EU policy, each member state has to do its part in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's not just carbon dioxide, that's also methane, and that's also nitrous oxide, which is one of the effects of the use of fertilizers. And the Dutch government came to a point where it only had essentially the choice between stopping all construction in the country, which wasn't an option, or stopping all aviation. It's a significant connecting airport, Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, or significantly reducing the amount of livestock farmers, because the Dutch government said, look, I mean, we are also an export market. Do we really need to be an export market for instance, Dutch cheese? And so it looked at how many farmers would have to stop their profession for us to get closer to the number we're looking for. And ultimately, the plan would have meant that until 2030, the Netherlands would have gotten rid of about 30% of its livestock farming business. And that meant that a lot of farmers would have to not be able to continue. And the way it tried to achieve that upset a lot of farmers because it said initially, we're going to buy you out. So we're going to pay you out of your profession to stop your profession. We're going to reimburse you for the costs. Now, some farmers were actually interested by this because they wanted to get out of the profession anyway, but that was a tiny fraction compared to the amount of farmers that said, no, we're not interested. This is a family business. This is rooted in our tradition for centuries. We don't want to give this up. And then I think the key point where the protests really started to become fairly, I mean, I don't want to say aggressive, but definitely very loud, was when a minister suggested that maybe this land buyback program might not be voluntary. It might become compulsory, and the government might just say your farm has been confiscated and here's the money to compensate you for it, but it's not an option for you anymore. And that, of course, that drove the farmers to the street in a fashion that the Netherlands has really rarely seen. We've had farmer protests in Europe before, but really never on this scale.
Wow. That's unbelievable. And to think about that, that it wouldn't be voluntary. One, the fact that it was being suggested, Two, it wouldn't be voluntary. That just seems so at odds to the free countries that we live in, and so many of those farms being multi generation. I could see why they were a little bit upset about that, right?
Oh,
Oh,
certainly,
wow.
certainly. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, farming is deep rooted in many European countries. I mean, if you the average farm in Europe is also significantly smaller than it would be in the United States or in Canada. That a lot of this tradition, it's the way you produce. It's, you know, also the fact that a lot of Europeans have been for a very long time going to their farmers to buy directly from farmers. So there's this deep rooted tradition and understanding of the value of farming. And again, just like in Germany, what we've seen is that the citizens in the Netherlands have sympathized with the farmers. And we had more than just polling, we had a pretty good test because in early 2023, there were provincial elections in the Netherlands. And the largest amount of seats went to a farmers' party that previously was just a very small party. And suddenly there was no way around farmers in order to pass this piece of legislation. Right now, the Dutch government is in a bit of disarray because it stepped down, then there were new elections, and they haven't been able to build a coalition ever since. It's been a while. But a Farmers' Party might even be part of the next government coalition, which means that no way goes past farmers in order to pass new environmental regulations. So significant setback. I mean, it's like a lot of people had to resign over this, and you can see there's real political repercussions if you mess with the farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, we've seen for so many years, we've done our professions. We've just farmed. Everybody's left us alone. I mean, there's been regulations and changes, yes, but as governments start to make farming more political, farmers really have no choice but to start paying attention and become more political, right? Unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah. If you're not interested in politics, politics will eventually be interested in you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the farmers in Germany, as we know, they started January 8th. They dedicated a week to make their protests. And then we quickly seen farmers from other countries join in. France was in there, and I can't remember the exact order of everybody joining, but it's pretty widespread. Are they under different regulations, policies, or is it just a general feeling?
So I think that's where I'm glad that in this format we can talk for a bit longer than some of the 4 minute segments I've been sometimes been only able to do on TV because it is fairly complicated and it's not all of them for the same reasons, even though the frustration of policymakers not having listened to farmers is the same, and the fact that EU policy applies to all EU member states in the same way, they do protest for different reasons. So, as we talked about, I mean, it has been fertilizer policy in the Netherlands. It was tax policy on diesel in Germany. In Central and Eastern Europe, it's about wheat imports from Ukraine. Essentially, the argument being right now, in order to support Ukraine, we're going to have free trade with Ukraine and allow wheat imports. But farmers are complaining that Ukraine produces under very different sets of regulatory standards, and thus the grain and wheat is much cheaper compared to what we're used to in many EU member states. And so that is unfair competition, and they've been blocking the border. And then, President Zelensky said it's only 5% that goes to Poland. It's been a lot of back and forth, and it's complicated because a country such as Poland is very supportive of Ukraine, but then also doesn't want to significantly upset the farmers. So that's a very complicated trade question. And in France, it's been a mix of almost everything. I mean, everything from trade policy to the bureaucracy surrounding water reservoirs to retail negotiations. So the French government negotiates with retailers and says, yes, we're doing something about inflation. We're going to bring prices of food down, but then the retailers cut corners by essentially, I mean, reducing what they pay farmers. And they say, well, sorry, the government told us to reduce food prices, and you're the ones that have to pay. Um, this whole pretense like, oh, we can make food cheaper, but nobody has to pay any money for it, right? That has been going on quite a bit since we've had our cost of living crisis following significant government spending during COVID, and that has increased prices across the continent, and now farmers are the ones that have to carry that burden and say this is just simply not doable anymore. Now, farmers have also directed that anger not just towards the French government, but also directly towards the retailers. So we've seen supermarket chains and fast food chains being broken into and vandalized. French protests have traditionally been a lot more violent than other protests. I mean, you can really call this tradition in France. It's just, clashes with police, violent clashes, and so on. So there's a lot of different reasons, but we see protests now in almost every single EU member state. And the complaints are, can we make a living next year, depending on what the harvest is like? What is the regulatory framework? Because we're not even talking about the regulation that is out there right now. I mean, the EU had been planning on a pesticide cut, for instance, of 50%. That used to be under consideration 80%. They had to scale that down, and that meant for many farmers that there was even the question of what are our yields going to be. Now, just to give you an example, in 2020, most of the sugar beet farmers in France were about to go bankrupt because they had to deal with insects that they had no protection against, because the European Union has banned the use of neonicotinoids, insecticides, and there was no alternative. So suddenly, sugar beet had to be imported to France when it used to be an exporting country for that for that crop. So I mean, it's been years in the making. I don't think this is suddenly an inspiration like, oh, the Germans were successful with their protest, let's start this as well. This has been brewing. I think what it has done is shown that farm politics is way more difficult to navigate for politicians than they initially thought. They can't just thread the needle in one direction or the other to try and make up for a deficit in the budget. It is way more complicated, and they're messing with the food system in a way that has not just farmers riled up, but also citizens sympathizing with farmers.
Wow. Okay, great explanation. So, throughout your description of the different countries and their concerns and their protests, there seems to be a common thread. And here in North America, I'm in Canada, we see, for the most part, the writing on the wall. And it didn't start last night or yesterday, like you said. They've been working on some policy that would affect farmers for years. But it really seems that the Green New Deal, I think I've heard you speak of it that way. It really seems that farmers, agriculture land is hot on politicians' minds. So, can you speak to the government? And really, it seems maybe if we're delayed here in North America, it seems like a worldwide concern and very aggressive environmental goals on each of these country and their government policies. Can you speak to that?
Yes, so in Europe, it's called the European Green Deal. It's inspired by the concept of a Green New Deal that was initially an idea from the United States. It was really taken as, as such also in Europe. And agriculture is a big part of that. So agriculture makes up for a not insignificant amount of carbon dioxide emissions. That is the reality. One of those reasons, by the way, in Europe is because there's very little, compared to North America, very little no-till farming practices. So, if you have a lot of crop rotation, what you do is you release those carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. So that is also part of the conversation. But then it's also much higher fertilizer use, and also the fact that by virtue of the farms being smaller, sort of the efficiency and the maximization of efficient resource use is just not the same as it is in North America. I mean, the farms are very small by comparison, and there has been very little consolidation in that sense in Europe. So that's part of the sort of the justifiable identification of the problem. Now, politicians have been trying to make it out as if farmers are causing this problem and they could do better. So one of the conversations in Germany, for instance, was that they said, oh, why don't you just use electric tractors? You wouldn't be, you wouldn't be polluting as much if you just used electric tractors. Missing the fact that an electric tractor, it costs about double than a conventional one, and also that Germany has the highest electricity prices in all of Europe, and it wouldn't, that electricity then also wouldn't be with a tax advantage, tax write-off in the same way that diesel currently is. So this would continuously increase the production costs for farmers. You sometimes see an environment minister like testing out an electric tractor, but it's cute as a prototype, but it doesn't really resonate with the actual needs of farmers. So you see a lot of these policies not really listening to farmers and being very idealistic about sort of the policy goals. So just to give like this pesticide reduction by 50%, I asked policymakers in Brussels, where does this number come from? Why are we cutting it in half? And what is it actually supposed to achieve? Where does that number come from? It's like, well, it's 50%. It is a political goal. It is no scientific backing. These are synthetic crop protection chemicals that were approved by EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, as safe for use in the way that farmers use them. But it was also decided that for some reason we have to get rid of half of them. And the reason for that is a lot of activism in the NGO field, environmental activists that have a very nostalgic, idealistic view of farming that has nothing to do with evidence-based policymaking, but they're very, very effective at lobbying European policymakers. I mean, the likes of Greenpeace and others, just to name one, have been very influential in trying to influence policies. And what they favor is really the model. I mean, this idea of if only we farmed the way our ancestors did, everything would be better. But that is just, I mean, honestly, that is really silly. It's a sort of asinine debate about that, because if we farmed the same way we did in the 1960s, I think at Stanford, they did this study that found that if we farmed the same way we did in the 1960s, we would need an increased amount of farmland equivalent the size of Russia in order to feed the existing world population. So we need another Russia that we would dedicate just for farming. I mean, it's just not possible. We have a growing population. Farming has become more efficient, so we need to play into that and use fewer resources to produce better and more food. And so we're living in Europe right now. We have this very ideology-driven policymaking, and I think that is likely to stop because we have elections in June, and it looks like there will be considerable changes. In 2019, when the last European Parliament was elected, environmental policies were the number one concern. The number one concern right now is not that anymore. It's not environmental policy. It is now security, because we have a war in Europe, and it's cost of living and energy, which also relates to cost of living. How are we going to heat our homes? How are we going to pay our bills? How are people going to afford food? Just for reference, in Romania, 25% of disposable household income goes to food. 25%, a quarter of what you have to spend each month goes to food. So that's significant. I mean, that's much more than in the United States or Canada. So I think we're waking up now to the realities of it, and I think the election will be quite determining in what the future of agricultural policy looks like in Europe.
Wonderful. You know, there is not one person that cares about the land and the environment more than farmers, which is the ironic thing. And what I've found and why I was so excited to have you on the show, and not a lot of people were watching the big and flashy videos of farmers protesting and making their discontent heard, but a lot of people don't see the writing on the wall. I'm fortunate to go to government meetings, industry meetings, and quietly behind closed doors here in Canada, there's a lot of talk about sustainability, ESGs, climate, all of that stuff, which is right across the world. And I was likely out of 500 people, the only farmer in there. Farmers aren't invited. And the unfortunate part, of course, we want to do our part and we're always working to do better, right, Bill? But the unfortunate part is, I would say very few of those people actually have a boots on the ground understanding about farming. And there was a huge disconnect. They said, we need to reduce our nitrous oxide in Canada by 30%. That was floated around and kind of hush hush, still talked about. And then they proceeded to say the ways they can do it. But farmers are against it, and we don't know how they'll be able to survive. And it'll likely be subsidies and maybe carbon credits. We don't know, and we don't understand why farmers are against this. And I'm seeing they're going, oh my goodness, the bulk of the people in there have such a disconnect. So to me, it's scary as a farmer and for our North America industry. That is why I wanted you here to really walk through the nuances of what's going on in Europe, because the same ideas and policies are being floated around here, carbon tax. And I think we would all be well off to look at Europe and go, what's going on? Is that coming here in full force? So you've shared a lot of great information. We've covered all the different countries and the nuances, the Green New Deal. Sorry, that's the wrong word. We've touched on North America. Do you want to share some parting words? I'm going to do a two-part question here. Some parting words for North American farmers and maybe just what to be paying attention to, thoughts. And then last, do you think the farmers are correct to be taking these actions? Because some people that are paying attention are going, that's wrong. They're wrecking property. They don't need to be doing this. So I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. I'll start off with the first part. You mentioned something very important, which is the questions of subsidies, and I think this keeps coming up, and it's been one of the strongest rebukes to many of the protests, where columnists, people in media, politicians respond and say, yes, but you are essentially just welfare queens. You receive direct payments through the Common Agricultural Policy. Look at the amount of money that we spend on farming each year. Why are you complaining that you have to pay a little bit more? And I think the complication with these subsidy models, each time when you implement environmental policy and then you try and mitigate the consequences with subsidies, is that essentially you're blurring the effects of the policy, because now it's hard to tell, even for people like me and you that look at these policies, it's really hard for us to tell, are the farmers benefited more through the subsidy scheme, or are they hurt more by regulation? Because the only way for us really to find out would be to dial down the regulation and dial down the subsidies and then see if the businesses are viable. We've had so many years of different types of subsidies and different types of regulation, to the extent that, at least in Europe, I don't know exactly how it is in Canada, is you almost need a compliance team of lawyers to run a farm. It's become so burdensome to comply with all of those rules. I think a lot of Europeans really felt connected to there's this Amazon Prime show, Clarkson's Farm, with Jeremy Clarkson, where he starts a farm. And it's like a lot of people were just unaware how complicated it is to not just do the actual work, but to also comply with all of those local government rules, and how close are you to the forest, and oh yes, you want to create a pond for insects so you can access the subsidy, but it has to be this specific size. And it's so over-regulated, so bureaucratized, that I think it's really important to pay attention to how do these measures value, like, square up against each other, and can we really make concrete statements anymore? And I think if the government goes out and says agriculture is the problem, they're being subsidized, they shouldn't complain, it's like, well, yes, but there's burdensome regulation as well that weighs on farmers. So I think it's good to keep all those aspects in, because otherwise we're just arguing in silos against each other. And I think it's important to really keep the overview on what makes this business run, because ultimately, yes, farming is tradition. It's a love for the profession, but it is also a business, and it needs to make money, right? Because people need to eat, including the people who make the food, right? So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And as per the last question, I I think it's not conducive of a good debate that convinces citizens if you destroy property, if you set things on fire, if you block roads. I think that's more complicated, because I think, yes, I mean, if all types of people protest for different things, and roads will be shut down in order to allow those protests to happen. That has always been the case. I think that's not a new thing with farmers. I think it's important that if farmers protest, that they do it the right way, that they make sure law enforcement is aware, and also distance themselves from radical elements within those protests, because that only harms the movement. I think some politicians in Germany try to cast the grievances of farmers aside by calling them far right, because a couple of far right people integrated those protests. I think if you're a representative of those organizations that organize protests, is to make sure to say we are apolitical, we're non-partisan, we don't want to be looped in with people that don't share our values. These are our specific grievances. These are the policies that we recommend instead, and then do it in a way that mobilizes a lot of farmers without having to set cars on fire and all of these things. Because I think eventually that'll get to a point where just the average citizen will not understand it anymore and just look at the destruction and not at the actual arguments being presented. So I think it's important to remain civil, even though that I can understand that it's very upsetting to people who have to make ends meet. But I think it's important for those, if those protests are supposed to be successful, they need to be civil.
That's a well-balanced answer. Thank you. So one last question to wrap up, and just to wrap on a positive note, a forward future-looking note. Are the farmers being heard? Are they being successful? Do you think this will make a difference? Is it? And do you think it will make a difference?
I think it will absolutely make a difference, because a lot of political parties for the coming election already are including in their manifestos policies that addresses the concerns of farmers. And that's a win of its own already. I mean, the rules in Germany have been scaled back. The French government has made some compromises as well. For now, though, there's no immediate break with EU environmental policy, because very often member states cannot actually break with that environmental policy because they have already agreed to it previously. The only thing that can actually change is for EU environmental policy to change. And we have an election in June that will decide the outcome of the next 5 years and what that policy will be. So I think if you're interested in this topic, I think for yourself and all the listeners, watch what happens in Europe in the coming months, because that will be indicative. Because what it would mean is that for all its grandstanding since 2019, Europe announcing to the rest of the world that we're going to become the green beacon of the world and we're going to show everyone how it's done. If there are changes to that environmental policy this year or next year, that would mean that we went from lecturing everyone else to having the protest and then changing the policy and showing essentially that there's a case study for how not to do it. And I think that will be incredibly valuable for people who work on these policies in other countries to show, okay, somebody's tried this before, it didn't work. So I think that's a very valuable lesson and something for people to watch out for.
Wonderful. Farmers face a lot of adversity, a lot of risk, a lot of uncertainty. We know that. But I don't think I'd be mistaken to say that egg policy over the next 6 years, they seem to be working towards a 2030 date. Egg policy over the next 6 years will be one of the hottest and most important topics, Europe and right across North America, I think. I don't think it'd be incorrect to say that, would you?
Absolutely. And I've written to that extent. I think I wrote a piece for the Boston Herald just over a year and a half ago where I made that claim. It's like agriculture policy is going to become the most important one. In the United States, for instance, I'm even surprised that that's not part of presidential debate questions. It's not really debated in that sense, maybe also because in the US, Congress has more influence over these things. I mean, Canada will eventually have an election. I'm curious as to what extent that will play a role as well. Will those questions be asked? I think for people working in media, I think it's important to not underestimate this topic, because a lot of people really underestimated it here in Europe. And are now suddenly have to learn about what those environmental policies actually are. And you saw that in the original reporting. A lot of people in media just didn't really understand why the farmers were protesting. So I think a lot of education is now happening in real time in Europe on these issues. So absolutely something to watch. And a lot of people are going to have to do their homework to understand it.
Well, and I'm so thankful for you to come on the show and really break it down country by country and what's all going on, because not a lot of people understand and are not paying attention. So, Bill, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your wisdom. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. You in the audience, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, like it, share it, and get it out there. Every single farmer needs to hear the great information that Bill shared. Thank you. See you next week. Bye, guys.